Final Fantasy XVI is notable in how it has introduced a number of not-seen-before elements to the long-running series, and one way that it has taken a new direction is by becoming the first mainline game to receive a mature rating. Characters frequently curse, risque content is depicted explicitly, and violence is more graphic than previous titles. However, it wasn't any of this that saw the game banned in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. While an official release was planned in these countries, the game saw its release pulled at the last minute. The Saudi regulators confirmed the decision in May, where they said it won't be possible for the game to be released due to Square Enix refusing to make necessary changes to the game's content. While not officially confirmed, the move seems to be due to the game featuring a gay couple who briefly kiss. These regions are among the strictest in the world in regards to the depiction of LGBT relationships, and this stance has seen many other games either banned or censored, such as the ban imposed on 2020's The Last of Us Part 2. The game has also not been released in Russia due to the war in Ukraine. However, while the war is what has stopped an official release, it wouldn't be possible even without the war due to an expansion of the country's gay propaganda law earlier in the year. The law now imposes a blanket ban on expressions of LGBT relationships, which means that modifications would be necessary to release the game in the country. However, the game does still feature a full text translation for both Arabic and Russian, and so it is still possible to import the game and play it in these languages. But to now speak more about the game's translation, and for that it's important to give some background information. Unlike most Japanese games, the translation process was more complicated than simply taking the Japanese script and localizing it into different languages. The game was first written in Japanese, then adapted into English by the localization director Koji Fox, and the English version was used for the lip syncing in all versions due to wanting to closer match the feel of medieval Europe, and being inspired by media such as Game of Thrones. And then finally, the script was then translated back into Japanese and the other languages. However, it is inaccurate to say the Japanese version is very similar to the English script, as there are many differences in dialogue. Furthermore, the Japanese script is often very different from the lip syncing, and so perhaps the final Japanese script is closer to the original Japanese script. Koji Fox also doesn't have a full writing credit, as he is only credited as the localization director, whereas the Japanese team is credited as the creative director, original screenplay, and scenario writers. To add to this, there is quite an interesting discrepancy with the French translation, as it displays a message in the menu saying that it is based on the Japanese translation and not the English one. The difference between translations are similar to what can be found in quite a lot of media when released outside of Japan, and as the game allows you to select different voice tracks, even people who don't understand Japanese will be able to pick up on differences. For example, quite often dialogue will either be much shorter or longer between versions, but then there are also things like personality changes, differences in tone, and so forth. An interesting difference between English and Japanese is also how the English version adds lots of swearing that isn't featured in the Japanese version. This is something else that is quite often seen in English releases, and to summarize, the Japanese language doesn't really have curse words like English does. While it has very specific curse words that can be directed at people, the linguistics and culture of more general curse words being uttered to oneself or directed at others don't really exist. However, sometimes localizers will feel it's appropriate to add cursing to English versions, but this practice is something that can be at times controversial. A good example of this can be found in the opening section of the game. First up is the English version.
You cock.
Benedictum.
Now again, the "you cock" translation wouldn't really be appropriate in Japanese, and so both the Japanese and French versions simply say the character's name, Hugo, instead.
Hugo. Hugo.
And so while the swearing is not present in Japanese, it's important to keep in mind that this shouldn't be seen as an act of toning things down. However, perhaps the same isn't true for a few other discrepancies between English and Japanese. For instance, a scene during the game's intro sees the characters given a mission to eliminate the dominant of Shiva, Jill. And so in the English version, one of the characters makes a remark about this, saying, "No one else? Where's the fun in that?"
You all know the target. Shiva's dominant. And only the dominant. No one else? Where's the fun in that?
However, in both Japanese and French, the character says, "Is it a female?" And then he laughs and says that there won't be any mistakes then.
女だろ戦場で間違えるか
C'est une femme. On risque pas de la rater.
This is clearly supposed to portray the character as saying that due to the target being a female, the mission will be laughably easy. So if this was featured in the very first Japanese script before being translated into English, it would appear that this was made less provocative in English due to concerns over sexism. The biggest case of toned-down dialogue between English and Japanese revolves around a scene between Jill and Imran, and this is something that affects the story. In the scene, Jill confronts Imran, and in English she says,
For years I followed your orders, fought your wars, all to protect the children you took, just as you took me. And what did you do in return? You put them in chains and you slit their throats!
Fiend.
And so this plot point is quite dark in English, but in Japanese it is more so. Unlike the English version, in Japanese, Jill says that the children were female, and that Imran violated them and then killed them right before her eyes.
娘たちを守るため。でもあなたは何をした？私の目の前で彼女たちを手ごめにして殺した。
The main term that is used here is tegome, and that, along with the context, makes it clear that this was the intent behind the dialogue. Interestingly, in this example, the French version is a direct copy of the English translation, and despite the message saying it's based on the Japanese, this is something that can be found in other places, and the French version actually appears to be a combination of both English and Japanese. And so again, while it's impossible to know for sure, perhaps this was a deliberate act of toning things down outside of Japan. Generally, however, despite the large amount of discrepancies between the English and Japanese scripts, there aren't many other instances where things are more or less provocative between versions. Furthermore, the game doesn't make any alterations to the graphics, and perhaps the biggest difference between versions outside of the translations is a difference between the music when playing with Japanese audio. When playing with Japanese audio, the song that plays during the ending scene and the song that plays during the credits are switched around, although there's currently not been any comment on why this was decided. But one more thing to point out is that despite it being rated mature in North America and 18+ in most of Europe, the German version is only rated 16+, and the Australian version only 15+. Again, there isn't any censorship between these versions, and so this is quite an interesting difference in how the differing rating systems judge the game's content. As always, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and until next time, thank you for watching.